it was really hard to come up with this message, not so much to come up with enough to fill a sermon time, but to decide what not to say, because there's so many other points that I would love to make with this message, because there's a lot to talk about. So we continue with our simple yet complex series about the Bible today. And again, as I mentioned, if you have questions about something, if there's a follow-up question from something I've preached previously, something that you've read about, you've always wondered, please ask me about it. Send me a text, send me an email, try sending a fax. I don't know what'll happen, but try it anyway. It'll be fun. I would really love to preach about some of the things that you guys are uncertain about. But I'm going to jump into this parable today. It's probably one of the most well-known parables of Jesus. When I say something like that, I always do try to remind you guys, if you don't know this story, when I say, oh, you guys should all know this story, if you don't know this story, don't worry about it. It's okay. That's why I'm here. I'm here to teach you guys this stuff. There's nothing wrong with not knowing about this. The only problem comes when we stop trying to learn, if we remember that. So, are we good with that? Cool, let's continue. So most people refer to this parable as the parable of the prodigal son. We can call it a few things, though. We can call it the prodigal son, we can call it the lost son, we can call it the two lost sons, we can call it the parable of the loving father, the parable of the gracious father, the parable of the loving father and his two lost sons, which is what I've titled it today. Before we dig into this specific parable, I do want to talk a little bit, understand a couple of things. What is a parable? What is the purpose of a parable? And what does a parable tell us and not tell us? So first of all, what is a parable? Well, in the most general sense, a parable is a story told to illustrate a point, a story with a moral, essentially. Now, you can certainly argue they're a little more complex than that, but we're going to go with this definition for today, that it's a parable is a story told to illustrate a point. And since parables are stories, remember, they're things that have not actually happened. For a parable of the loving father and his two lost sons, this isn't a story that truly happened that Jesus is referring to. Now, something similar may have happened at some point to some family, but that isn't why Jesus is telling this story. He's giving this story to make a point about something. And we'll talk about what that point is in a little bit. The purpose of a parable. Well, as humans, we really love to dissect things. And I don't just mean frogs in 7th grade. Did you guys do that in 7th grade here? How many of you have dissected frogs? Okay, I just wanted to make sure that this wasn't some weird North Dakota thing where they gave us frogs and said cut into them, and this is just normal, right? Fetal pigs? A little bit of that, okay. Rats? No, it did not. This isn't, I can't go off on tangents today. When I was in EMS, I did the coolest lab one time. I didn't even need to do this, but it was really cool because I needed some refresher hours for my dispatch or something like that. And I was with a group of people who were already paramedics, and we did what's called a heart and lung lab. So they actually had a heart and lung set from a butchered pig, and we got to dissect it, and it was the coolest thing ever. And because they were all already paramedics and they'd done this lab in paramedic school, they let me do everything, and it's really cool because okay, anyway, let's move on. I don't know why that came to mind, but that was so much fun. Anyway, where was I? We asked questions. You guys don't have plans this afternoon, do you? I'm on page 8 of 65. We want to know more. We have this thirst for knowledge, right? Now, I'm the kind of guy, I spend way too much time on social media. Anybody else guilty? Yeah, I know, I'm not the only one. But a lot of times random posts come up, people asking questions about different movies or TV shows. Now, if you're anything like me, if you're about my age, you probably grew up on the Back to the Future movies. Yeah, the best movies ever. I grew up on them. I know them inside and out. And so online, people love to ask questions about these movies. Why did this happen? Why did that happen? For example, in Back to the Future Part 3, now just to refresh your memory, in Back to the Future Part 3, Marty travels back to 1885 to rescue Doc, because at the end of Part 2, the DeLorean was struck by lightning. Doc goes back to 1885. Marty's standing there in the rain. The dude comes up from Western Union with a letter, and, "Are you Marty?" And he gives him the letter, and he goes, "The Doc's alive!" I'm acting this out more than I had planned. I had way too much sugar this morning. I had coffee and Mountain Dew. This isn't a good combination. All right, so anyway, Marty from 1955 goes back to 1885 to bring Doc back to 1985. But when Marty gets to 1885, he tears a fuel line in the DeLorean and loses all the gas, right? So they have to figure out how to get the DeLorean up to 88 miles per hour without using the gas, since they have no gas. So eventually they hijack a train and they push the car to the 88 miles per hour to get Marty back to the future. But Doc stays in 1885 because he met his beloved Clara. Aw, I hope one day to meet my beloved Clara. So the question is, why didn't they just siphon gas out of the DeLorean Doc went back to 1885 in, put that gas in the 1955 DeLorean, and then head back to 1985? You ever think about that? Why didn't they do that? Because if they did that, then there's no movie. That's it. That's the whole reason. Also, at the end of Back to the Future Part 3, how did Doc know that Marty and Jennifer would be by the railroad tracks at the exact moment that he and Clara and their boys come back on the train that he converted into a time machine? The answer? That's what the script said. I just wanted to talk about Back to the Future today, I guess. But we kind of need to remember that those questions, there's so many questions like that that don't really need to be answered. And we do that a lot when it comes to parables. Not all of the questions we ask about parables shouldn't be asked or are silly or pointless. Some of the questions are. One of the questions that a lot of times we ask about this specific parable that we don't necessarily need to ask is, for example, in Luke 15:30, the older brother says, "Your son has squandered all of your money on prostitutes." How did the older brother know that? The older brother knew that because Jesus wanted him to know that for the point of the story. That's really all that we need to know there. Another thing to consider about these parables, and not just this one, but all parables, the New Testament is a collection of first century documents written to first century people. So when Jesus speaks, he is speaking to people living in the first century in Roman-occupied Palestine, in areas of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. If Jesus were here today telling us these stories, he would do it in ways that we would understand better living in 21st century Hiawatha, Kansas. It doesn't mean we can't understand what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. It doesn't mean the message or the lesson is irrelevant. It doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to us. But if we're going to look at these parables, at these stories, and pick up on different things, we're going to hear some different things than the people 2,000 years ago in Judea or Galilee were hearing. Does that make sense to you guys? Culture changes. Language changes. Take the King James Version of the Bible, for example. I know a lot of you are somewhat familiar with that. If you don't know the King James Version of the Bible, think Shakespeare. Sounds a lot like any Shakespeare play that you may have read. King James Version of the Bible was published over 400 years ago using the language that people spoke 400 years ago, which was appropriate and understandable in the early 17th century. But language has evolved into what we speak today. Much of the King James, is still understandable. It is. But some of it is just not coherent to us in the 21st century. That's why we have modern translations of the Bible. So that's maybe a little deeper than I wanted to go in our introduction, but that's okay. Let's get back kind of to the surface and talk about this parable of the loving father and his two lost sons. So as I always say, again, if you have your Bibles with you, open to Luke chapter 15 so you can kind of follow along. This is the third parable in Luke 15 that's about something that is lost and then found. The first parable there is the lost sheep. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." The second is the parable of the lost coin. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin." And then the third parable in this chapter is, of course, the lost son or the lost sons. Just to recap that parable, the younger son goes to dad, asks for his share of his inheritance. his share of the estate, and dad divides the property and gives the younger son what he asks. The son goes off, squanders what he has, and a famine engulfs the country, so he gets a job. And his job is to feed pigs. Well, it must not pay a lot, because he's still hungry, as we read in verse 16 here. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. The pods he was giving the pigs would not be edible by humans, by the way. The young man comes to his senses. He decides to go back to his father and asks to be hired by his father. Not to go back as a son, but go back as a hired servant. He knows the father's servants are being well fed, so he might as well go back and have his stomach filled. So he prepares a speech. "Father, I have sinned. I am no longer worthy to be your son. Please hire me." I paraphrase that, of course. He leaves to go to his father. Still on his way, still off in the distance, quite a ways from home, dad sees him. And dad, filled with compassion, runs out to his son, throws his arms around him, embraces him, and kisses him. Now the son starts to give this prepared speech. But dad doesn't even let him finish, and he calls on the servants to bring the son the best robe and a ring and sandals, and to kill the fattened calf for a feast to celebrate. Why does he want to do this? Verse 24, "For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. But the older son is out in the field. When he approached the house, he heard a ruckus, music, dancing. So he asked one of the servants, "Hey, what's going on here?" And the servant said, "Oh, your brother came home, so your dad is throwing a party." Well, the older brother is definitely not happy about that one. He becomes angry. But dad comes out and tries to calm things down, and he invites him in. Verse 28, it says, his dad pleaded with him. The older son, with all this built-up emotion, all this built-up resentment, he lets it all out, starting in verse 29. "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." Dad's reply? "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." First, let's talk a little bit about the main message we need to get out of this parable, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper. I would argue that there are probably at least two main messages for us to get out of this parable. The first is the loving, caring, forgiving nature of the Father in this story, which represents the loving, caring, forgiving nature of our Father in heaven. And just a little preview for you here, I'll talk about this more in a bit. Don't equate the Father in the story with God the Father in heaven, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. That idea of the nature of God, a God who is so good that he welcomes us back no matter what we've done, no matter how many stupid things we've done, no matter how much we've messed things up. You ever make any mistakes? You ever mess things up? You ever do stupid things? Or is it just me? I know I'm not alone here. God the Father is quick to forgive and quick to forget. The second main message here is celebrating the return of what was lost. Remember, this is the third parable here in Luke 15 that has that same lost and then found theme. The lost sheep, found. The lost coin, found. The lost son, found. Now that we kind of see the main message or messages of the parable, I think we can dig a little deeper. Can ask a few questions about the parable. And I feel like I'd left something on the table there, and I'm not really sure what it is about the main message, but I think if we just keep that main message in our heads and remember what that is, then as we start to dig a little deeper, we can kind of understand even better our role in this. So as I said, we kind of like to find other meanings in these parables. And again, it's okay to ask these questions as long as we don't lose sight of that main message. And I want to explore what I just mentioned a minute ago. As we look at this parable, we might be tempted to assign roles to the Father and to his two sons in ways that aren't needed or intended. One of those ways is to say that the Father in this parable is God. Now, there are some problems with this, however, because if we say that the Father is God the Father, then who are the sons? Is one of the Son Jesus and the other Son the Holy Spirit, representing the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit? And if that's our argument, which is which? I mean, both sons here are very, very imperfect, but Jesus never sinned. So how can we say that either Son represents the Son, Jesus, of the Godhead? Next, how can our Father in this parable represent God, God the Father, if Jesus is the only Son of God? The Father in our story clearly has two sons, so that should make us question this idea that the Father in the story is God the Father. So if you want to think that the Father in the story is God, it's not quite a perfect match for us. And it's probably better not to assign that kind of role to the Father. What we should be doing here, what's best to say here, is that the Father demonstrates the nature of God. The Father isn't God in our story, but the Father demonstrates the nature of God. This idea that I mentioned earlier, that God is infinitely loving, infinitely forgiving, infinitely merciful. That's what the Father displays in this parable. When his younger son comes home, he simply welcomes him back. Son, I'm glad you're home. When his older son refuses to come in, he goes to him and pleads with him to come join the celebration. There's another common interpretation here that I'm guessing a lot of you have heard. A lot of people will say that when the younger son goes to his father and asks for his inheritance, it's the same thing as that son going to his father and saying, Father, you are dead to me. I want to go off on my own. Give me my part of the estate so I can go do that. Anybody heard that one? Really? Wow, I thought that was a little more, yeah, one or two people. So this idea that he goes and by asking for his part of the estate, he says, Father, you're dead. This is likely not the case, however. You're in good company if you've read that and you've believed it, but this is probably not the case. This would not have been a common request by any means, but it was not unheard of at the time to do this. The question also of, is this request sinful, will come up. Is the request sinful? When I've read commentaries, other books on this parable, there are a lot of different ideas about that. Some people say it's a violation of the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. Others will say it's uncommon but not sinful. And if it was sinful, then the father actually has a duty to call out his son on that sin and refuse the request. But the father doesn't do that. He doesn't say, son, you're making a bad decision. This is a sinful thing. I can't honor that request. Dad says, okay, here you go. So the inference here is that this isn't sinful. It's just probably not a good idea. If we dwell on that issue, of was this a sin or not for the son to ask, to dwell on this issue I think is more of a distraction from the main message as opposed to diving deeper into the meaning. This is one of those areas, though, that gets really tricky. Because if you read books on this parable, if you read 4 books on it, 2 authors are going to say it's sinful, while the other 2 are going to say it's not. Now, I know that's a bad answer. It's just not a satisfying answer. Is this sinful? I don't know. I know that's a bad answer. But I needed to mention it because I figured some of you have at least heard that argument in the past. And I wanted to mention it, even if there's not a strong consensus one way or the other. For us today, if we look at this parable today, what else can we get out of it? How can we apply it to ourselves right now after we've understood the main message of celebration and acceptance? When you go home today, how can you incorporate this parable into your life? Well, the most common thing that we can do when we dig a little deeper is ask, who am I in this story? Am I the younger son? Am I the older son? Am I the father? I think for the most part, we identify first with the younger son. If you are a Christ follower, if you are a believer, you are likely going to identify with the forgiveness the younger son receives. We recognize the sin. We recognize the failings in our lives. We have gone back to our loving Father in heaven, and He has welcomed us back. that sinful life is no more. We are back home with God, which is exactly what he wants for his creation. And for non-believers too, this is a great example that no matter what you've done, no matter how far you've drifted from what is good and right in God's eyes, you can go back. You can return to your loving Creator. And he will forget all the dumb things you've done and simply welcome you back. Just like the younger son. But have you ever thought of yourself as the older son? Let's look at some of his characteristics. He stays home, he works hard, and because of that, he feels he deserves his father's love more than that of his brother. I did all the right things. I didn't sin. I didn't run off and waste your money. I stayed here and worked hard for you. I slaved for you. My life was not my own. I did everything for you. There's probably one term that best describes the older brother. Self-righteous. Does that sound right? Self-righteous. I did all the right things. Where is my party? You ever see a little bit of yourself in the older brother? I guess most of you guys would work pretty hard for what you have. I would guess that. I've seen it, so I know you do. Why then, if we're all working so hard for what we have, why for so many of us can we sometimes barely make ends meet? I've been there in my life. And then we look around and we see so many others that don't do much of anything or don't do the right things, and they have everything. Somebody out there can record a video of themselves shaking their butt around, put it on the internet, and make $1 million. That ain't right, man. What about crooks? People that know how to use the system. People that have a tip about buying the right stock because something's going to happen that they know about. Or maybe a company closes and lays off all their employees, but management got these massive bonuses even if they were doing things that were wrong. Is that fair? You did everything right, or you think you did at least, but someone else sees the benefits. That's the mentality of the older son. Now, I don't think these examples I came up with are perfect examples here, because we shouldn't celebrate crooks unless they repent and come back to what is good. But it's the idea here of, I did all the right things, so I deserve more, yet maybe we don't realize how much we really do have. And without seeing why, in this situation, when the brother came home, without seeing why we need to celebrate. We can see ourselves in the younger brother. We can see ourselves in the older brother. Can we see ourselves in the father? What a great example of God's loving nature. Yes, we should strive to be more like the father in our parable. Younger son, son, welcome home. Older son, son, I know you're hurting, but you still have everything. Please come celebrate with us. We need to exhibit that forgiveness the Father shows. That we need to have the celebration that occurs when what is lost is found again. But don't think that the Father in this story is perfect. I'll get back to that in a second. Let's go even deeper now. Again, if you don't keep your focus on the main message, you shouldn't be asking these other questions. Once you figure out the main message of forgiveness and celebration, then we can start to dive a little deeper. And I think it's a lot of fun to go deep and consider some of these things. But again, if we lose sight of that original message, loving forgiveness and celebration, we might as well forget the entire parable. So just a moment ago, I mentioned that dad might not always be the best one to look up to. He isn't perfect. There are a couple things to consider here. I mentioned one of those earlier. If the request of the younger son was sinful, then dad had a responsibility to call it sinful and refuse the request, but he did not. So if it was sinful, that was a big mistake on dad's part. Yes, the father is displaying the loving forgiveness of God, but he also does a couple other things that are questionable. The first one is, we look at what happens when the son comes back, when the younger son comes back. Yes, dad runs out to his son. He hugs him. He kisses him. And the son says, "Father, I have sinned against you and against heaven and you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." His speech is cut off. And how does dad respond Does he say to the son, no, son, you don't say anything else. You are loved. You are welcome to come home. I love you, Junior. Is that what happens? If you read it, Dad doesn't even talk to his son. He turns to his servants and says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. There's a lot of joy there, but why doesn't he express that joy directly to his son with words? Maybe I'm reading too much into that. I'm not sure. But I know I'm not the only one asking this question. I have this book. It's called Short Stories by Jesus by Amy Jill Levine. Highly recommend this book, by the way. That point that I brought up and the next couple are from her exploration of this parable. Highly recommend this book if you're looking for a book on parables. She doesn't cover all of the parables, but she goes into great detail with some of the best known ones. And I think one of the really cool things about this is Levine is Jewish, so she looks at the parables with a very different mindset than we would look at them. So go buy a copy of the book. That's my plug for the day. This video is not sponsored or anything. That's just, anyway. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. Younger son comes home. Dad throws him a party. Older son is out in the field. And he finds out about the party from one of the servants after he heard the ruckus. Dad didn't tell him about the party. Dad didn't tell him that his younger brother had come home. Maybe the older brother has a point here about feeling neglected. Again, remember the main point of this parable. Loving forgiveness, celebration. But maybe we can remember that point, that we are to be loving and forgiving and to celebrate when something lost has been found, but we can also remember that in our own imperfections, we too can display these godly traits. Dad may not have been perfect, but he showed that love to his sons. The last thing I'll mention on this deep dive part of this message is also from Levine's book. It has to do with the younger son. We read, starting in verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. Levine, in her book, questions his motive here. Yes, it says he came to his senses, but is he still manipulating Dad? I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Yet throughout this section, where he's kind of reasoning about what he's going to say to Dad, he still refers to Dad as his father. Not his master or his lord or his employer. He's going to go ask for work, but he still calls him Dad. Servants would call him master. But the son prepares his speech. Father, 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 I, your son. Is he trying to trick his dad into accepting him back home? Or is he truly being contrite in his words and his actions? I'll let you guys decide on that one. There are a lot of other things that I wanted to talk about with this message today, but I had to cut things off somewhere. But the last thing I'll talk about in this message before we head into communion is this. You may have heard some say that this story ends without an ending. We aren't told what the older brother does when the father invites him in. Have you ever noticed that? We don't find out what the older brother does. It's not that Jesus forgot to give us an ending to this parable. This is how Jesus wants to leave us as hearers. The last thing we get is the father talking to the older son, pleading with him to go to the party, pleading with him to come in and celebrate that his younger brother, who was lost, is now found, who was dead and is alive again. We don't hear what the older brother decided to do. Did he walk away and go back out in the field? Did he go into the party? And if he did go into the party, did he sulk in the corner or did he truly celebrate? Did he leave home that night and never return? Jesus doesn't tell us. And he does that on purpose. He doesn't tell us because he wants us to think about what we would do. Do we celebrate that person who has done no good in their life? That person who has only done wrong things and has benefited from doing the wrong things? Do we celebrate when they experience forgiveness and grace? Or do we maybe lament not having been a little more wild in our own lives? Do we welcome the sinner home with open arms? Do we find ourselves coming to our senses and returning to our loving Father after we've messed up? One great lesson we can take home with us today is, despite not being perfect, the Father in this parable saw the value in both of his sons. The son who ran away was welcomed home. The son who stayed but was distant was still invited to come in to celebrate with the family. The Father saw both of his sons mattered. Both of them were important. Both of them were loved. And we too are loved by our Father in heaven. No matter what foolish things we've done, no matter how far we've drifted, we can return and be welcomed back into our Father's loving arms. Turn back to him today.